Hello, and welcome to the Bardic Inspiration.
Hello and welcome. For today's episode, we're going to be delving into the mind of one of our lore bards, or valor bards, or Dan.
Hi,
So,
I'm here, and I showed up.
how long have you been playing D&D?
I have been playing D&D for, I believe, 4 or 5 years now, at the time of this recording.
What got you started?
I originally started when I know it started at least with Nate. Were you there too, Jacob?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And we had, I knew about D&D before, but not, excessively. I had heard about it, but it was never something I tried doing. And I know one time before we, very briefly tried doing it. And then one day Nate was like, hey, I want to run a game of D&D. And we were like, oh, okay, sure, let's try that. And we played one session, and right?
Yeah.
Yes, one session. We had two. We killed ourselves. I survived, and I would have made it to the next room, but we never played after that because our plan. We got very greedy, and we decided that in order to make ourselves rich, we would backstab our other party members. So me and one of my other friends grouped together and made a plan. One guy died during the fight. And then afterwards, we teamed up and killed the other guy.
Doesn't help that one of them was chaotic stupid.
What was your first character?
My first character was, I believe it was a paladin. But I wasn't a very good paladin, nor did I understand the concept of anything about role-playing.
But you learned over time.
I did learn over time, and I learned pretty well, I would say, pretty quickly.
Yeah. So obviously you started as a player, but when did you start DMing?
I want to say I started DMing maybe a half year or so after I started playing, because it seemed like a really interesting idea. Part of the reason why I like D&D a lot is when I was younger I wanted to be an author, because I liked the idea of writing my own stories and a lot of fantasy work and everything. But I was very bad at writing, so I never became that great at writing stories or anything. So when I learned about D&D and I kind of got a better understanding of it, I was like, oh, I can almost tell my own story with other people and have a fun time with it. So at one point, I remember, with more or less the same group, so Nate and Jacob were a part of it, and originally this was still when Nate started DMing a different game, and then after a while I was like, I want to try DMing. And so I remember I tried DMing for a little while. That was in 3.5.
That's right.
It was 3.5 edition.
I lent you the rule books for that one, did I?
Correct.
Yeah.
And then I found an online thing also and got some rules from that and kind of figured out a little bit about it. And then I want to say not even a month or so after I started doing that is when 5th edition came out. And then by this point I was already completely in love with playing this game.
Yeah.
So I went out and I got and bought the things for 5th edition and then transitioned that session into 5th edition.
Right. I started everyone into 5th edition. I invited you and Gannon, and then you started getting into it, and you started designing your own world. So.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember being very reluctant to move on to 5th edition.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
We actually pulled Nate into that after your
right.
advice.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And then ever since then, that was the last time I DM'd for a while, because after I converted that game, then I started playing in other games, and just my own session didn't really fall off. And then a couple of times I DM'd in between other games, and then until recently just wasn't really DMing at all, and then maybe started DMing more seriously for the last year or so.
Yeah. What title would you have in our group, obviously?
Obviously the rules lawyer / the living book, or the embodiment of the rule books. Pretty much any time that we're playing a game, either if a DM doesn't know how a ruling goes, I'm the first person that gets asked, and half the time if someone asks about how a certain spell or a certain mechanic works, usually we just ask me before we even check the books.
Only very rarely is he ever wrong.
Very rarely.
What kind of rules have you changed as far as dice rolling in the very beginning and things in your home game?
Oh, okay. I know that a couple of my rules. So one, for starting characters with stats, like in the book, there's like standard array or point by. A lot of people tend to do ones like roll 4d6, drop the lowest score. 4d6 reroll ones is one that's popular with our group. For me, I like doing 5d6 and you drop the lowest 2 die. I use feats a lot more common than other people do, where I instilled a rule where basically you get one at first level, and then every time your proficiency bonus goes up. And the reason I do is because whenever I DM, one of my thoughts is, well, what would I want as a player? And one of the things that I like as a player is having a lot of like creativity and versatility with my character. And then also I want my character to be good at least some things. And so when you do like the 5d6, that gives you a better chance of rolling high. When you have a bunch of extra feats that you get to use, you can kind of create more interesting or more powerful characters with certain aspects of the game, which is what I like because I want to be a hero when I play. So a lot of my decisions come from, well, would I like this as a player? If so, then I should let my players enjoy that same thing when I'm running.
So
Okay.
you wouldn't mind at all if you were like too overpowered with that.
I would probably, like, I enjoy the idea of playing, like, say, a wizard with no strength or an extremely low constitution. So I understand that, like, having, like, really negative flaws or really bad stats. But at the same time, yes, I do enjoy having characters that, for the things that I want to be good at, I want my character to be good at those things.
So if you have heroic characters and you like these heroic stats, how exactly would you go about TPKing these heroes?
The best way that I've learned to TPK heroes in my time is thematically, you want it to be the most, like, depressing and hopeless feeling ever, where almost as if you, like, put them in a situation where they're like, oh, I'm gonna succeed. And then something goes wrong, a bad die roll or whatever, or like, oh no, extra reinforcements or monsters appear. And all of a sudden things take like a turn for the worse, and then, say a character goes down, and it's in a way that the rest of the party doesn't expect. And then it puts the rest of the party on tilt, if you will, and they start panicking, or like trying to save that person, or they start doing things that they wouldn't normally do. And then it eventually just starts costing mistakes, and eventually it just sort of falls apart around them. Another way is to get them in unexpected ways, which AJ was a part of once, where I had a beholder that, to make it a short story, would be, they had fought this beholder previously and had won, but circumstances of the campaign happened to where they had to fight this beholder again. And they came in a lot more overconfident this time. They came in like as far as the circumstances of this fight, everything for them was on an upswing, so that this fight should have been easier. Yeah. And they ended up getting TPK'd in a way that one of them actually got petrified, and the other one, there were only 2 PCs in this campaign, and the other one essentially got knocked unconscious. He got put to sleep and plummeted to his death.
Yeah.
And it was very unexpected for me. It was very glorious, because I hadn't anticipated them losing for the same reasons they didn't. They already did like a really good job of this fight before. So I was like, oh, this should be really easy. And then everything just went really bad. And
That's the thing where the die roll can
Yeah.
really...
We really didn't take notes on how we went about it the last time. We initially slayed a person that we were supposed to slay, and we didn't do that in the second round. So I was the one that got petrified, and my friend got...
which, if I remember correctly, you got paralyzed first.
Yes.
And
I
then
couldn't-
you got
I couldn't
petrified.
save
And because
at
you were
all.
paralyzed, you couldn't succeed against the petrification.
Yeah.
Hey,
So
at least you weren't denied your glorious death.
I got broken apart 300 years later or something. along
Yeah,
those
you got
lines. So I
revived
was
eventually.
alive, but
So you
it's
heard the
still-
aftermath of the
It
campaign.
was a TPK.
But yeah, so to answer that question, like, with overpowered characters, there's... And that's another reason why I like having people with overpowered characters, because it can make you overconfident and it can make you make mistakes. And then all characters, whether they realize it or not, have a weakness of sorts. It's just a question of figuring out what that weakness is, and then as a DM going, if you want to, okay, how do I exploit that?
Pride.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
With all the talk of a powerful character, powerful players, out of all the classes, what is your favorite class to play as or have as a player?
Oh, okay. My favorite class, I would probably say I have two, actually. One of them would be a paladin, just because it mechanically it has the ability to just deal a lot of damage really quickly. You know, you can divine smite something, and you can choose to do that after you hit the target already.
Right.
So it's not something you have to like
Save for.
use and think to yourself, oh, what if I waste this?
Yeah.
You can always make it a guaranteed thing. And then you can just like pile on top of that a lot of like extra buffs and bonuses, to the point there was one game I was in recently where I was playing a paladin where, granted, I had a Holy Avenger at the time and we were fighting a fiend, so I had a lot of odds stacked in my favor. But I made like 2 attacks and I did like 150 damage between those 2 attacks just from all the smites and the Holy Avenger benefits and everything.
What level was that?
We were level, I believe, 12,
12.
if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
That much damage.
Yeah, and so it made the fight go by really easily. And then paladins, it's just, they have healing ability. They get what I think is one of the best abilities in 5e, which is the Aura of Protection, where it's you get to add your charisma modifier to your saving throws and all your allies' saving throws that are within 10 feet of you until you get to, I think it's 18th level, and that goes up to 30 feet. So I like paladins for that aspect because I like being a healer and I like being able to help my teammates. But then I also enjoy the idea of, I can also deal a ton of damage to this opponent, say in like a boss fight or something.
You were pretty much a healing, moving, damage dealing tank.
Basically.
Yeah.
And then my other one that I like, kind of for similar reasons, is a sorcerer. Just because as a caster, you have the ability to manipulate your magic in a way that you can do a lot of fun things with it. You can... the way I would play them is more of like a blast caster, so dealing a lot of damage. You can see a common theme with my play style. Or the other one is you could use it to kind of manipulate, use certain spells to like control the battlefield, if you will, to sort of debuff your opponents in ways. So it's just the versatility of sorcerers that I really like, how they can use their meta magics to just sort of either get extra spells or make it harder on the opponents or make your spells stronger. So it has a lot of different uses to it.
Okay, then what would be your least favorite class?
Least favorite class.
Exact opposite. You've got a tank and a glass cannon. What would be the opposite of that?
Mechanically
Glacier.
and in general, I think warlocks to me are they're tricky. And for the campaigns that I've been in, they're my least favorite just because they feel very limited in what they can do, because you only get like on average like 2 or 3 spell slots to use in a fight. Now granted, they're the highest spell slot that you have, so it has that benefit. But outside of that, you don't really have like a lot of different spells to choose from. It has like about as wide of a selection as a sorcerer does, but you can't cast nearly as many spells and you can't manipulate those spells in such a way that if you don't have a party that short rests a lot, you lose one of the warlock's greatest strengths, which is getting back your spell slots on short rests.
Right.
That being said, I also realize that they have Eldritch Blast, which is arguably one of the best cantrips in the game. However, it does get a little depressing after a while in a campaign where you're playing a warlock and you realize if you're not Eldritch Blasting, you really can't do anything else.
Yeah, you're pretty much an Eldritch Blast spell caster.
Exactly. You're like a small like damage dealer every round, and that's the extent of what you do.
Just saying, it's not bad to magic initiate a Eldritch Blast Hex combo.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with that 100%.
So we've covered the class. How about your favorite race and least favorite race?
My favorite race would be half elf. I like the skill versatility that they get is a nice benefit. You get the bonus to charisma, and you get the boost to other stats. They get a lot of languages because, you get common, elf, you get to pick an extra language. They have a lot of the elven resistances, so no sleep or being an advantage against charms. So they're just a very strong race, in my opinion. I would say they're the best in the book, to be
Well,
honest.
they seem to go so well with paladins and sorcerers. too.
Exactly. They go well. They also go well with bards, which is another class I really like. Least favorite race. I'm not necessarily sure if I have a least favorite race, but I do think the Goliath is a little underwhelming for some parts. But then just because it has a lot of similarities to half-orc, and when I read it, a lot of the time I feel like I would just be better as a half-orc than I would as a Goliath. But yeah.
Okay. What is your favorite background?
My favorite background would probably... Sage is a really good one I like a lot, just if you're playing a character that has a good intelligence and what you want to know about history and things and campaigns, and you want to get background information on stuff a lot, so Sage works really well. Otherwise, I think my other favorite one is in Sword Coast, is Far Traveler, but that's more so just because you get perception and insight as skills, which are very good wisdom-based skills that you can use a lot in different situations, just perception being as useful as it is, and then the insight in social campaigns, it gives you an ability to sort of let you know when the DM is trying to trick in or kill you.
All right. Well, now that we have some of your favorites and least favorites, why don't we combine them all? Why don't you share with us your favorite character and your least favorite character you've played as?
Ooh, that's a good one. My favorite character that I have ever played as, and I'm still playing him to this day, in the longest running campaign that I have played in, is named Azir Rain. He is a half-elf sorcerer that is multi-classed into Bard, Monk, Cleric, and Warlock.
Did you have a term for this class?
Yes, he is also known as a Bunk Lockeric. It basically is... It originally was just supposed to be a Bard Monk, and then eventually the joke just became, because I kept adding in, I got a level in Cleric, and I was like, oh, just multi-class into everything. It had really high stats in that campaign,
Yeah,
so I was able to multi-class into everything. I think my lowest score is a 15, so it's a really good character. And he's a great character to roleplay as, also. He's basically evil. I would describe him as basically a man that believes that he is right in any circumstance, is extremely overconfident in his abilities. He can back that up. And basically any other person's view that he doesn't agree with is essentially wrong. He is also a werewolf, because he got bit by a werewolf. And he has died and was revived. And
Why don't you...
in general is a really fun character to be. Least favorite character...
No,
That's who it is.
I half expected you to say Arden, just because of current circumstances.
Oh,
right now.
no,
Right.
that's okay. That's fair. I think when I sit down, a lot of the time, there's different characters that I may play as that they're not what I'm used to. They're not the same as what I normally play as. Say, for example, what Daniel was saying, I'm playing an Eldritch Knight that was very severely nerfed. His name is Arden. Long story, but basically, he started with an intelligence of 16, and now his intelligence is 10. And his stats are worse than a standard array. But that being said, there are aspects of playing as him that I enjoy, kind of for those same reasons. He has so many negative flaws, but then in that same situation ends up being, in certain situations, one of the best characters in our party. That makes it very entertaining to play as. And then he also has this gives it away a little bit, but I pulled from a deck of many things, and I got the services of a level 4 fighter, who now basically serves as my secondary character / bodyguard.
Who
and
outdoes you in every way.
pretty much. And I'm also I was a good potions maker, or poison maker, not so much anymore, but I have that, like, added buff as well, so, he's still fun to play as, it's just different than what I'm used to.
So it would be fair to say that 5th edition is your favorite, or?
5th edition is my favorite. I've only played 3.5 and 5th edition.
3.5 was only briefly.
3.5 was only briefly. However, just from what I know of other editions compared to 5th edition, I feel like it's also just one I would like more anyway, because it's a lot more, like, streamlined, the numbers are a lot smaller than the other editions from what I've heard of.
And
The mechanics of it are very simplified, that there's not as many stats that you have to look at and change and use.
Okay, then follow-up question. If there was a mechanic in 5e, and you would want to change it, what would that be?
I think one thing I would change would be sort of the book's way of using feats. Kind of like what I said earlier. I like having extra feats and everything because it lets you create your characters a bit more, I guess, creatively, a bit more freely. You get to kind of experiment with different things and build them in more fun ways. Another one that I would probably change would be there are some abilities that if you're, like spells, for example, where if you use them, they can be very useful to you unless the person you're using it on saves against it, and then they just do nothing. And that makes it almost seem like your turn was kind of wasted and there's not really a benefit to it. So I'd maybe say, like, edit some abilities.
Like whole person?
Yeah, to where
Like,
maybe there's some sort of effect even if it does not succeed.
Do you prefer to have your players have a background with some detail, or have it more fleshed out and planned?
I think I prefer having my players, when they are building their characters, what I like having them do is sort of think about, like, who they are and kind of come up with an idea of, like, what they want their character to be in the world. So, in a way, like, kind of flesh out their backstory, come up with decisions of how they want their character to exist. And then I like having my players come up with, like, people or, like, places or, like, a thing that is very key to their backgrounds, because then you can reference that or use that in the campaign. It helps them sort of involve themselves more in the world, and then it lets them feel more a part of it, and it makes them interact a bit more and pay a bit more attention when you bring up, like, a key name or a key point about something.
Right, I have a follow-up question. How much of the backstory do you wish to know? Or do you wish it to come out in game, or do you prefer to know as the DM ahead of time, like the entire thing, not just the key features as you were requesting?
It's a bit of both. I think that there's some instances where, like, say for example, if one of the things that's very important to them is the name of, like, a city or a place that they're from, then obviously I would want to know that beforehand, so I'm aware of what it is, and then I can use that. But then there's other things where, like, maybe there's, like, a key story or a key part of their backstory that isn't necessarily something that would be prevalent at the beginning of a campaign. Maybe it's not something that they know about. One example off the top of my head is let's say for their background they chose the Inheritor. And so they're supposed to get some sort of item or object or thing that is part of their background. That may not necessarily come up right away. That could be something that may not even happen, like, in the first, like, 5 levels of the campaign. It may not even be something that is addressed until near the end of the campaign. It could depend, and based on that, it could be something that we won't necessarily discuss beforehand because it's not something that would be put to the forefront.
Okay.
I'm gonna skip around a little bit on this list. What's your biggest pet peeve that your players tend to do?
I think for me, one of the main issues I would have is when players, not necessarily that they don't pay attention, but when they like you say, like, something, or you, like, mention a part of, like, an aspect of the campaign as, like, a point, specifically something that would be relevant to that character, and then either, like, they don't write it down or it's not something that they, like, keep track of. And this could be like anything. It could even be like if they get a magic item or something, and then it's like, okay, take down this magic item, and they like don't, or they take down only parts of it.
Right.
And then later they ask me, hey, what does this do? And I already have a bunch of different things that I'm already focusing on as the Dungeon Master that I don't necessarily have the time to track what this item does for that player. Now, in some instances, it can be solvable if it's like an item that wasn't like the DMG or something, but a lot of the times I'll make alterations or something and I'll tell them that at that time, and then I'll forget about it. And part of the reason I do that is because I want to be surprised. Because I don't want to think to myself, oh, I know what they have, so they could use that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be like, here's this problem, let them come up with a solution. And they're like, oh, I have this item. But then if a player's like, oh, I don't know what my things do, what can I do with this? And then they're like, hey, how does this work? Or what did this item do again? And I'm like, I'm not sure anymore.
Okay. Do you make sure that you write it down before you give it out to people?
Sometimes I write it down beforehand, other times I will come up with it on the fly.
Okay.
And that does have a lot to do, again, with me wanting to be surprised. I think a lot of the time what happens is people will, in games, players will get like an item, and the DM knows that they have that item. And then it becomes this weird game of like, based on that item that you have, things are going to change around that. Mm-hmm. I don't want that to be a thing per se. So a lot of the time I'll change things about the items, or I'll just give items to players, and I won't remember anything about it, because I don't necessarily want to, because I want to be surprised.
Okay.
I want to be shocked when my player's like, oh, I'm going to use this secret, like, hidden sphere of annihilation that I've had for, like, half the campaign. And I'm like, you have what now?
So it could definitely work against them if they don't write it down.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, because then if they don't write it down, either they don't know what it is, and if it's something I came up with on the fly, I'm not necessarily going to remember what it did.
Right.
So chances are I'd be like, well, I guess your character just forgot how that item worked or something.
Right.
Unless it's something that was like more like pertinent, like maybe if it was like an item, say like a plot item to say, like a mission quest kind of thing, then I would probably remember. But if you get something at level 3 that's like some weird wand that does like some weird spells, and you never use it, and then at like level 12 you're like, hey, I have this wand, what does this do? And I'm gonna look at them and go, I have no idea where you even got that, so you tell me.
So what kind of creatures, whether they be NPCs, monsters, what's your favorite to run? What's your go-to to put into an encounter, like a random encounter?
A lot of the time I go towards a lot of humanoid races, so a lot of like the NPC stat blocks in the back of a monster manual or Volo's guide, though I'll also edit a lot of them. Tend to be my most common one that I choose. In particular, I really like using spellcasters a lot, because in games that I play in, they're not usually used as often. And I like using them because it kind of makes players think a bit outside the box when they're not being faced just with a guy running up and attacking them with a sword. Now they have to be a bit creative, and they're like, oh, these guys are actually using spells, and they have like plans and stuff. How do I figure out how to beat that? As far as monsters themselves, I really do like dragons, which is probably good for the fact that this game's name includes dragon in it. I think dragons can be very fun to use, and in different ways can be used that like players don't necessarily expect. Kind of like what I was saying before with like using a spellcaster. There's a lot of ways you can use a dragon that doesn't involve it just flying up and attacking people with its claws and biting, but it could like fly away, it could retreat, it could fight the characters in like a battleground, flee, only to just show up again later and just keep them on their toes. And you can use them in a lot of ways that isn't just a direct head-on confrontation.
Okay, and what about your least favorite then?
Oh. Flumps? Flumps are not friends. So, there is a small story with Flumps that I've had an issue with, that ever since then, whenever I've like used them or thought of using them or other people have used them, it's just been very soured for me. Because the way that they're described, is they're these very intelligent creatures that have a lot of knowledge and information, and they're supposed to be very wise creatures. They kind of just float around in the Underdark. And my issue with them is the one time that I specifically remember running into these Flumps, they were just kind of there, and they weren't really doing anything in particular. They weren't serving a purpose. We talked to them, they gave us absolutely zero insight into the situation that we were in, and we, asked them questions that we were like, oh, they probably know this. They live here. And they didn't know a thing. And then they just kind of, ambled around and cried, and then I think we got into a fight while we were talking to them. Some random monsters came in, and I think we fireballed them by accident, and they died, which was probably good, because they weren't really that useful after that. And then in other situations I've had where, even in instances where I've had Flumps, in my own game, that I've tried using, and they just feel very out of place a lot of the time. They never, to me, seemed, fit very well. And so because of that, it just doesn't work for me.
Okay.
Other least favorite would be spiders, because I don't like spiders.
Okay, so what's your favorite spell to use, and what's your least favorite that you've seen play out in a bad way, or...
So favorite spells, there's a lot, because there's a lot of good spells out there that can be very useful when you don't necessarily think that they'll be that useful a lot of the time. Friends is a very useful spell, actually. Shield is probably the best spell ever, considering it's a first level spell, and as useful as it is even at later levels, it can be extremely beneficial. I personally really like Hold Person is a really nice spell, and then by extension at 5th level, Hold Monster is a really good spell, just being able to stop something literally in its tracks. So there's a lot of spells that I think are really good. I think of least favorite spells, ironically, I think my least favorite one is Wish. Just because of the fact that it very much depends on how the DM interprets your wishes, and how much of a jerk your DM actually is. Because you could have instances where you use a wish spell, and if you just kind of come up with something and you're like, I wish to be really powerful, and if you don't really give any sort of loopholes or anything, and your DM feels very tricky, they'll try to manipulate it in a lot of ways, I feel, to just make it so it ruins it for you. And I always find that odd, because other spells have a set this is what this spell does, and more or less explains this is what the spell accomplishes for you. So it's very certain in that respect. Wish is very much, here, Dungeon Master, please shape my future for me, and please be kind and generous. And oftentimes they are not. Myself included.
So word those wishes very carefully.
Right. And even then, you can word them as carefully as you can, and if they're very creative, there'll be some loophole that they probably will use. Granted, that may not always happen. You could have an instance where Dungeon Master is I want to be very powerful, and they're like, oh, okay, make your strength 26 or something. Cool. That would be great. I don't necessarily know that will happen. Yeah, right. Well, then you would wish for, I wish to be really smart. And then, they're very kind for some reason. That just, I feel isn't a norm. So.
Would you say that it's based off of who's either giving the wish or casting the wish that determines on how out of context the wish would be?
It could. I just, in this instance, specifically meant if a player casts wish themselves in wishes, and then it's quite literally the DM, them asking the DM for something.
Would you want to see any of your campaigns turned into other forms of media, say a movie, a book, a TV show?
Ooh.
And if so, which one?
I probably definitely would. There's a couple that come to mind. There's one campaign in particular that I am a part of, that Andrew is also a part of, that has a very near and dear character to my heart, his name is Azir Rain. And he's basically what I would describe as a sociopath, to put simply. And that campaign in general would be very interesting to see in, like, maybe, like, TV show form, or even a book, which there's a chance that that could maybe be a thing eventually. I would hope it to be some sort of a thing at some point.
I think Randy's working on something along those lines.
Hopefully. We do have a blog of it, which is available to read. But it is it's a very fun campaign, and I really like it. And it's very, very socially driven, and there's a lot of roleplay to it. So there's a lot of conversations. There's a small amount of politics, not exactly. But there's just a lot of good, like, social interactions that happen a lot of the time. And I feel like it would be something that actually would be adapted decently well in, like, a TV show. It has a fair amount of drama and intrigue throughout.
Now, in your own games, is there anyone that inspires you? Do you watch anything that you take great inspiration from?
Not really. I do watch and, like, track or read about other campaigns. And I think they're very fun to listen to, and I think they're very intriguing. However, I actually usually don't grab any ideas that they have and try to use them in my own. If anything, I feel like I watch them or I see them, and they do something, and I go, dang it, that was my plan.
So looping back on TPK, have you ever used a Tarasque in your campaign? And if you haven't, how would you present it to the party?
A Tarasque, oh boy. At the current moment, no. I have not at any point thought to myself I would use a Tarasque. Specifically in my own campaigns where they stand right now, that it's not something that would necessarily fit or make sense per se. However, I could eventually see myself at some point running a campaign where there is a Tarasque. It would probably be very much like the climax of the campaign. Like, it would be this is it. Like, it'd be a world-breaking event, to be sure. Quite literally. It would definitely be very dramatic. The Tarasque would probably, if it's on the surface of a campaign, it would probably, like, erupt from the ground. Probably in a very populous location at first, so it'd be a lot of destruction right away, a lot of confusion. The party would have to sort of rush to the situation. And then, because of that, it would be very chaotic, so there'd be a lot of different things going on. That even while the party is like, oh, there's this giant subterranean monstrosity just tearing its way out of the ground, and there'd be all these other problems, you know, like looting could be an issue, people panicking, and even while the characters are, like, trying to be extremely heroic in solving this problem, there would be all these other issues going on that you'd be like, can you just cut that out, please? We're trying to deal with the giant lizard that's literally blocking out the sun. Can you just please put that TV down, please? As far as how the players would fight it, I don't know. That would be up to the party. I feel like, just based on how Tarasque works, it wouldn't go well for them. And I feel like a lot of people would underestimate it. They'd be like, oh, we can do this. We've looked at that stat block before. We know what it's capable of. But I don't think until you're fighting it, you would actually realize how dangerous it really is. So
It could be said for a lot of D&D creatures.
Oh yes, absolutely. Players vastly overestimate creatures all the time and get caught off guard a lot.
Okay, so you're primarily a 5th edition player, and you have a little experience in 3.5, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Have you ever looked into any other systems that you found intriguing that you would like to try?
I mean, I've always been kind of interested in trying other versions of, like, similar systems, or other systems in general. I haven't necessarily had the chance to play them. I believe one's called Dragon Age, if I remember correctly, that I saw once that I thought that would be really interesting to play.
Yeah, that was on tabletop, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I know Pathfinder is a lot like 3.5 for Dungeons and Dragons, so Pathfinder's also been one that I've looked at before. I have never played it, but I've thought to myself, oh, this could be interesting to try at some point. And then another instance is we did once play a like small like mini-series game of a Star Wars D&D game, or Star Wars D&D-esque Star Wars game. It was actually like a Star Wars role-playing game, is what I think it was actually called. And that one was pretty fun too. It was also a lot like 3.5, which was kind of nice because it was something I was decently familiar with, and then it was in the Star Wars universe, which I love, so it was pretty fun. But I'm open to trying other systems. I just haven't necessarily had the time or like the outlet to try those systems.
So you've mentioned a lot about monsters and characters, the difference between, you know, the type of stories you like to run and play in. What about environments? Environments can entirely change the way an encounter runs or the way that people react in a certain scenario. What would you say is your favorite environment, both for an encounter or to be in, like to run a campaign in general?
I think as far as where the party is, that can change on its own. I'm very fine with that. Like, I don't have an issue with, like, if it's in an urban setting, if they're out in, like, the wilderness, mountains, dungeons, whatever. I do tend to find myself above ground a bit. I very rarely use dungeons. Not because I don't want to, they're just not things that necessarily pop up that often in my campaigns. As far as, like, a specific, like, scenario of an encounter, I always like, if you use like a battle map and you're using like a grid and miniatures and everything, I do tend to find that terrains that can be like manipulated or altered in some way, or something happens in that terrain that like edits the encounter in some way, I find very fun to use, because then it's a different obstacle and it makes it more challenging for the players. Again, going back to like, I want them to be creative and come up with new ways of how to deal with a situation. One instance of this, for example, that I could use recently is there was a battle that my players were in recently that was relatively straightforward. There was like a river and like some trees and stuff, and then there was this magical floating wagon that was just kind of in the battlefield. And up to this point, there was no knowledge about this thing. The players hadn't interacted with it before. They never saw it or anything. And it was, as far as they knew, just like a magical transport. And one of the players in the party fired a lightning bolt at that was targeting other people, but in its path was this wagon. What they didn't know is the wagon had defensive properties that would make the lightning bolt in that case shoot back at the caster. And this is one of those situations where there was no way beforehand that they necessarily could have known that until it happened. It could have never happened the entire time, but the fact that it did suddenly changed how the fight was going to happen, because now there was this added element that now, say if the characters used any line spells, they would have to make sure, oh, let's verify that this wagon isn't in the way. And if it was, then we have to make sure not to, like, let that be a thing. And then, like, other ones that I've thought of is instances where if, like, you stand in, like, a certain section, maybe your spells become more or less powerful. Maybe you, like, walk somewhere and everyone in that area has, like, a minus to attacks with, like, strength-based weapons or something. Things like that can be very interesting. Moving platforms are also good.
Okay.
Alright. What is your favorite D&D module that you have ever used before, or maybe participated in?
Oof. There's a couple that come to mind. I think one that I actually really liked, just because it was very simple and I played it, I think, 2 or 3 times. And each time it was fun just because it was a little different. It was pretty short, but the starter set for 5th edition, actually, I felt like had a pretty fun, intriguing sort of like 5-level mini-adventure for it that I thought was pretty fun. Another one I actually really liked running, though we never got a chance to finish, was the Curse of Strahd campaign. Was a really fun one, just because it was a very like difficult campaign adventure to play in, and for the most part, everyone in it did a good job. It just was a bit more challenging than they were used to, and it was pretty refreshing also. And then to run it, it was also fun because it was a little more creepy than campaigns that I was used to running. So,
All right. With those out of the way, let's try a lightning round for you.
okay, let's do this.
Are you ready?
Simple instructions. First thing that comes to mind, answer the question as quickly as possible.
Okay.
We'll run through these. On your mark, get set, go. If there is a monster you had to spend a day as, what would it be?
Kawatawa.
Favorite feat?
Toughness.
Favorite dragon.
Blue.
Favorite fiend?
Pit Fiend.
Would you rather be a kobold or a goblin?
Goblin.
If you were stuck with one cantrip, which would it be?
Friends.
Minis or dice?
Dice.
Favorite character level?
11.
What is your favorite color?
Blue. No, wait, green.
Alright, and with that lightning round coming to a close, we're going to go ahead and end today's episode. Thanks, Daniel, for answering our random and spontaneous questions. Until next time.
Yeah.
Thank you for staying at the Bardic Inn. If you would like to hear more, we will be uploading new content Thursdays at noon PST on
iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Castbox, and Podbean.
If you have any recommendations on future content, you can leave a comment on these various platforms, or you can contact us on Twitter at the Bardic Inn, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Bardic Inn.
We're your local bards.
Daniel.
Andrew.
Dev.
And Jake.
Be inspired.